Watching Nexstar's continuing coverage of the impeachment hearings of President Donald Trump. Today, the first day of testimony within the House Judiciary Committee. After 2 weeks of testimony on the Intelligence Committee, the Judiciary now taking up this inquiry. And we heard today from 4 legal scholars, constitutional law experts from Harvard, Stanford, UNC, and George Washington about their thoughts on whether the president's conduct rises to the level of impeachment, and particularly which types of behavior described in the Constitution the president allegedly broke. I'm Evan Donovan, political anchor for Nexstar. I'm joined here by JB Buno, who is our digital anchor for our Nexstar Now stream. Thank you so much for being here with us. A lot of testimony to get through this morning, about 2 hours that we heard from and the expertise of these experts. JB, anything that stood out to you so far in what you've heard?
Just in the comment section here on Facebook Live that, of course, our nation as divided as ever when it comes to the subject of impeachment of President Trump. I've been monitoring all the social media activity across Facebook and Twitter. And as with previous hearings in the House Intel Committee, you are either, at this point, you are either for impeachment or against it. You are for President Trump continuing his stay in the White House or against his stay in the White House, and it's been interesting to just see some of the comments. And we're going to get into the comments here in a little bit.
We certainly will. I first want to bring in our guest. We have a guest here with us in studio, Jessica Ehrlich, who is an attorney and Democratic strategist, former congressional candidate in 2012. Jessica, thanks so much for being here.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Love having you here, and thanks for sort of making sense of this while we were watching, and I want to get you to do that for our viewers here. First thing, anything that really stood out to you so far this morning in the testimony?
I think the testimonies that we heard this morning have really laid out, from a legal standpoint, the case that is being made for impeachment by the Democrats here, and we're going to see that even develop further. In the previous testimonies we heard in the Intelligence Committee, it was very much as to the facts and what happened, the timeline of events. Mm-hmm. Now we're hearing from a legal standpoint, what actually does high crimes and misdemeanors mean in a legal setting, and what is the basis from a legal standpoint to move ahead with impeachment of the president.
And we saw a slate that was put up actually to that effect of what Democrats believe they thought the president has done here and why it rises to the level of high crimes and misdemeanors as laid out in the Constitution. And you're looking at the full screen right here now. Abuse of power and bribery, obstruction of Congress would be the other thing. Obstruction of justice really sort of encapsulated within that. They played some clips from the president where he said, we are not going to comply with these subpoenas. We know that numerous White House officials, including Secretary of Energy Rick Perry, most notably former National Security Advisor John Bolton, he has said that he does not want them to testify, and some of those officials have not testified as a result. These are the charges that I think we're looking at, basically the preview of what the articles of impeachment would entail. Is that how you read that?
Yes, absolutely. I think from the report that we got last night from the Intelligence Committee, now what we're seeing coming out from the hearings so far in Judiciary, when they put together basically their indictment that they'll send to the floor for a House vote, and then what'll be sent over to the Senate, I think that's exactly what we're going to see in terms of the enumeration of what they feel he's done that deserves impeachment. And
a reminder for those of you watching at home, the Democrats control the House. That's why they control this committee hearing. There were some comments that we saw that I'll get JB to get to in just a moment about, why they're getting to ask, they're getting to call the number of witnesses. 3 of those attorneys were called by Democrats. There's really only one who opposes or believes that the conduct of the president does not rise to the level of impeachment. And I think that's one of the reasons why Democrats mostly called on the other 3 rather than Jonathan Turley, the professor of law from George Washington. But because they control the House, that's their right, is it not?
Well, and it's a standard practice in most, the general public who's watching these probably has not watched a lot of hearings that happen in the House. And on all committees, you generally will see whoever is in the majority plans who are on the panel and who will be the witnesses. And there's certain rules there that they have to follow for each committee as to when they have to turn in their testimony that's written, how they answer questions, et cetera. But in general, that would be why. And I think what we saw so far was the committee's attorney, Norm Eisen, and the chairman. We haven't seen any of the members actually questioning the various witnesses so far, and I think we're going to see that moving forward. Most likely, the Republicans will focus more on Professor Shirley, but it could be mixed when we see them move on.
Certainly. You're hearing from Jessica Ehrlich here, Democratic strategist and attorney, former candidate for Congress. I'm Evan Donovan, political anchor here at Nexstar. I want to bring in our D.C. Bureau correspondent, Trevor Shirley, who's also been watching these hearings this morning. Trevor, thanks so much for staying with us. Anything that stood out to you so far this morning?
Well, just the interesting perspective of each of these experts coming from their own backgrounds, laying out what they say either is or is not the case for impeachment. That's been what's really interesting to see, kind of given each of their individual backgrounds and kind of how they're approaching this same set of facts.
Yeah, absolutely. And we saw a lot of consensus among the three witnesses that were called by Democrats. Of course, Jonathan Turley, who's written a number of op-eds in the past few weeks talking about the president's behavior not rising to the level of impeachment, was sort of the fourth attorney. There was actually a moment there, too, where Norm Eisen, who is the attorney for Democrats on the House Judiciary Committee, asked Turley a question, and he began to give an expanded answer and sort of got cut off not be allowed to do that because obviously Democrats are trying to make a case here and they didn't want any information to go against that. Do you feel, Trevor, you saw that exchange right there. Political implications of that? Anything that you see here that might harm Democrats from the way that they're conducting these investigations?
I mean, I think most of this has been pretty predictable and par for the course. Each of these experts is bringing their own perspective to this. That's to be expected and understood. So nothing so far that I think has moved the needle one way or another.
And I want to bring Jessica back in for that same question. We talked about that while those questions were being asked. A lot of people feel like this is a partisan process. It's certainly on the right as well. That this has been done solely because Democrats don't like President Trump. They did seem to focus those questions on those three experts that agree with them. Do you think they'll suffer anything politically as a result of that?
I don't think so at all. I mean, that's the general nature of the way that these sort of questions go in the beginning of a hearing. And we don't get to see like the full trial per se until we move to the Senate. So right now, this is the same sort of situation we've seen even in like Benghazi hearings and anything else. They try to keep the questions, the answers to either yes or no answers or to the specific of what was asked. They cut off the witnesses. That happens repeatedly. They have a limited time frame in which they can ask these questions. Mm-hmm. So whether that tips the scale, no, I don't think people are sitting at home. If they think that these are unfair hearings or that this shouldn't be happening, that sort of questioning is not going to change their mind.
And it's important. You actually bring up a great point. The common phrase you hear on Capitol Hill, elections have consequences. And the fact that Democrats won back the House in 2018 means they get to control this process to call the witnesses that they want to call and conduct the hearings in the way that they want to conduct them. The same thing happened when Republicans controlled the House, as you mentioned back in the Benghazi hearings.
Yes, and it's why it's so important also that we have a balance, and we generally do historically, between the control of the White House, the House, and the Senate. There's only been, of a few instances where we've had them all controlled by one party in the last, say, 4 decades. And we've seen that probably twice, I would say. But it's very important then we have a balance of powers. I mean, that is one of the main, I think there's some confusion sometimes with people as to what Congress does and doesn't do, and one of the main roles of Congress is to be a balance of power to the executive branch, because these members in the House in particular have been elected by their constituencies, which are smaller individuals. It's not like the whole state of, Florida, where for senators, and they come from all over the country and represent different views of different people on a more local level. And that's one of the reasons that our founders created our government the way that it is.
Yeah, you might argue that it was created specifically this way. The House can impeach, but then it would go to the Senate where you need a 2/3 vote to remove the president from office. That's where you see that bipartisanship being required, because if the House believes that the president did something wrong and they do impeach, you still are going to need bipartisanship in order to remove the president from office.
Yes, absolutely.
So you could argue that
there has to be some consensus that is reached.
Right.
So, and I think to your point earlier that you made regarding the witnesses we haven't heard from because the White House has not let them. I mean, there's also Mick Mulvaney. There's Rudy Giuliani himself, which we've seen in the phone calls that have been now, the transcripts and things that have been coming out, in Ambassador Sondland's WhatsApp messages. So all of these things we will see more of when this gets to the Senate, because that's when an actual sort of trial will happen.
I was going to ask you about that. One of the complaints about this process, and as we just talked about, Democrats control the House, so they can run this process the way they want to. But as one of the big complaints was that the president didn't have representation here, that both sides weren't able to call witnesses. When we get to the Senate, if impeachment articles are drawn and the House votes on them, it would go to the Senate where they would hold a trial effectively on whether to remove the president. Can the Senate then, and you may not know the answer, but I want to ask because you might, can the Senate subpoena Rudy Giuliani and Mick Mulvaney and the other people that we haven't heard from to try to get their testimony?
Yes, they can. So and similarly, the way that the House Judiciary and Intelligence also subpoenaed various people, but they just refused to come. Now there are actions that can be brought against them, and what will be interesting to see, will the White House comply with the Senate because Mitch McConnell and the Republicans are in charge? Will they be more likely to allow testimony in the Senate that they don't allow in the House?
Interesting. You mentioned the founders and what they drew up about this process. That was a lot of the focus of this morning's hearings, and I want to get to some of the sound bites that we heard. JB, what's up first?
Yeah, we have we have sound bites from Feldman. We have sound bites here from Shirley, just highlights of some of these moments. So I don't know, Evan, whatever you'd like to hear first, but there were some interesting moments from all the different attorneys that we heard from here.
Yeah, there certainly
in the
were.
first half of today's hearings.
Let's hear from I can't remember whether I believe it was Feldman actually who talked about whether or not one of the big defenses of the president, particularly from Republicans over the past few weeks and months, as more and more details have come out about this phone call and about the president's subsequent behavior, is that perhaps it might have been inappropriate what the president did,
Yes.
maybe not acting the way that we would want a president to act. We've heard that defense from a number of different Republicans, but these witnesses, and particularly Noah Feldman of Harvard Law, spoke directly to that this morning, saying that what the president did was in fact impeachable.
Let me be clear that on its own, soliciting the leader of a foreign government in order to announce investigations of political rivals and perform those investigations would constitute a high crime and misdemeanor. But the House also has evidence before it that the president committed two further acts that also qualify as high crimes and misdemeanors. In particular, the House heard evidence that the president placed a hold on critical U.S. aid to Ukraine and conditioned its release on announcement of the investigations of the Bidens and of the discredited CrowdStrike conspiracy theory. Furthermore, the House also heard evidence that the president conditioned a White House visit desperately sought by the Ukrainian president on announcement of the investigations. Both of these acts constitute impeachable high crimes and misdemeanors under the Constitution. They each encapsulate the framers' worry that the President of the United States would take any means whatever to ensure his reelection. And that is the reason that the framers provided for impeachment in a case like this one.
So many objections is working.
And you heard right there from Noah Feldman, Harvard Law professor, talking about the president's behavior. He says, if you look at the Constitution, that the president's behavior did reach to the level of an impeachable offense. And that's effectively what we're hearing from these four witnesses today. They are there not as fact witnesses to what happened. They were not on the call with President Trump and President Zelensky on July 25th. They are testifying as to this is what we heard over the 2 weeks of testimony in front of the House Intelligence Committee. Now that we know what the president did and what the subsequent actions were, the timeline around it, we had a number of fact witnesses who testified to all of those proceedings. What happened is it impeachable? And that's effectively what today's testimony is all about. But they don't all agree. There are 4 witnesses here. 3 of them were called by Democrats and do agree that the president's behavior rises to the level of impeachment. But the 4th, Jonathan Turley from George Washington, says this process is effectively wrong. And we have a soundbite from him that we want to play for you right now, where he talks about how this process isn't right.
So we're all mad. Where has that taken us? Will a slipshod impeachment make us less mad? Will it only invite an invitation for the madness to follow every future administration? That is why this is wrong. It's not wrong because President Trump is right. His call was anything but perfect. It's not wrong because the House has no legitimate reason to investigate the Ukrainian controversy. It's not wrong because we're in an election year. There is no good time for an impeachment. No, it's wrong because this is not how you impeach an American president. This case is not a case of the unknowable. It's a case of the peripheral. We have a record of conflicts, defenses that have not been fully considered, unsubpoenaed witness with material evidence. To impeach a president on this record would expose every future president to the same type of inchoate impeachment. Principle often takes us to a place we would prefer not to be. That was the place 7 Republicans found themselves in the Johnson trial, when they saved a president from acquittal that they despised. For generations, they've been celebrated as profiles of courage. Senator Edmund Ross said it was like looking down into his open grave. And then he jumped because he didn't have any alternative. It's easy to celebrate those people from the distance of time and circumstance. In the age of rage, it's appealing to listen to those saying, forget the definitions of crimes, just do it. Like this is some impulse buy Nike sneaker.
Professor Jonathan Turley of George Washington Law School right there talking about how he believes the president's conduct did not rise to the level of impeachment and that this inquiry is wrong. Your reaction, Jessica?
I think he's making more of an emotional argument that we've heard from some Republicans, and that, yes, this is something that the president did that was not good for the country and perhaps was very bad and he shouldn't be done again, but that it doesn't rise to the level where we should oust him from office because it is such an enormous move. The enormity of that action is such that it should not be taken lightly.
Professor Gerhardt of UNC Law School actually said in his testimony that if this doesn't rise to the level of impeachment, then nothing does. That particularly the request for foreign interference in American elections is one of the things that the founders were most worried about when they drew up our founding documents, and that's why this process is, in his view, is impeachable. I want to play for you one more soundbite because I thought this was powerful, and this part, I think, is something that a lot of Americans agree on, that we like to fancy ourselves as the example of democracy in the world, that we believe that we are that shining city on the hill, a famous quote that Ronald Reagan used, as we're watching right now live the Judiciary Committee.
A live yawn there. That was a live yawn.
A live yawn from Chairman Jerry Nadler as he walks back into the room here. I'm not sure that we have enough time to play it. What do you think, JB? Should we get to it?
I think we're gonna have time.
All right, let's go ahead and play a quote from Professor Pamela Karlan of Stanford Law School as she talks about America being that shining city on the hill.
And I want to say something about what our national interest is today, because our national interest today is different in some important ways than it was in 1789. What the framers were worried about was that we would be a weak country and we could be exploited by foreign countries. Now, we're a strong power now, the strongest power in the world. We can still be exploited by foreign countries. But the other thing that we've done, and this is one of the things that John Winthrop said in his sermon in 1640, and what Ronald Reagan said in his final address to the country as he left office. We have become the nation that leads the world in understanding what democracy is. And one of the things we understand mostly democracy if the party in power uses the criminal process to go after its enemies.
Sorry, we had to dump out of that, folks. We want to say goodbye to Jessica Ehrlich, our Democratic strategist. Thank you so much for joining us. We want to go back, say goodbye to Trevor Shirley on the Hill, our D.C. Bureau correspondent. We're going to take our live impeachment hearings right here as they come back now.